Hi, I'm Jake Jones. I'm a junior in digital enterprise systems, and my project is about the worst nuclear reactor failure on American soil, Three Mile Island accident. Now, the name sounds a lot scarier than the outcome actually was, but make no mistake, this was a massive setback for the nuclear industry. And when you trace it back to its root causes, almost every single one comes down to a failure in configuration management. Three Mile Island Unit 2 experienced a partial nuclear meltdown on March 28, 1979, in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, right outside of Harrisburg. It remains the most serious nuclear accident in U.S. nuclear power history. Now, here's the thing, as scary as a partial meltdown sounds, the actual health impact to the surrounding public was minimal, but the damage to the industry, to public trust, and to the future of nuclear energy in America was enormous. So, what good came out of it? Quite a bit, actually. The accident forced the entire industry to overhaul its safety practices. Nuclear plants across the country were required to meet far more rigorous safety regulations. Operators had to complete significant more training, and emergency response protocols were standardized nationwide. Perhaps mostly important thing, it led to the creation of the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, or INPO, which made nuclear power sustainably safer for every community living near a plant like Three Mile Island. Three Mile Island was operated by Metropolitan Edison Company, known as MetEd, which itself was a subsidiary of General Public Utility Corporation. Unit 1 of the plant opened in September 1974. Unit 2, where the accident occurred, only became operational in December 1978. That means the disaster occurred just 3 months after Unit 2 just started. To understand why this happened, we have to understand the nuclear industry at this time. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, nuclear power expanded rapidly across the United States, but that growth came with almost no standardization in how plants were documented, configured, or controlled. Design changes frequently weren't tracked, information wasn't reliably communicated to operators who needed it, and there were no formal framework ensuring that what was built actually matched what was designed, and that what operators were trained on matched what actually was running. After Three Mile Island, all of that changed. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission mandated rigorous configuration management practices, essentially laying the groundwork for what we now call CM2 principles: identification, control, status counting, and auditing. Now, industry shifted from being reactive to proactive, and configuration management became embedded sources in an entire life cycle of plant operations. So, how did the core concepts of CM2 map to what had happened at Three Mile Island? Let's go through each one, starting with configuration identification. The pilot operated relief valve, or PORV, was a critical component in the cooling system, but its actual open or closed status was never properly identified or monitored in the control room display system. The system didn't distinguish between what was commanded and what was actually happening. Second, the configuration control. During a maintenance procedure 2 days prior to the incident, isolation valves on the auxiliary feed water systems were left closed. No change control process flagged this as a risk to reactor cooling. There was no formal record of a component being left in a non-normal state. Third, configuration status accounting. Operators had no accurate real-time picture of an actual system state, which believed that PORV was closed when in fact it was open, and coolant had been draining for 2 hours before they understood what was happening. And finally, configuration audit. Prior to the accident, there was no formal audit that verified whether control room indicators were actually reflecting true component status. Nobody had gone through and checked, does this mean what it actually says? Every one of the 4 pillars of CM2 broke down at 3 Mile Island. Now let's get into the specific technical failure. The primary configuration item that failed was the pilot operated relief valve, the PORV, located at the top of the pressurizer in the primary cooling system loop. Here's what happened. The PORV opened automatically as exactly it was designed to do during a pressure spike, but then it failed to close. Coolant began draining from the primary system, and it kept draining for 2 hours. Meanwhile, back in the control room, the indicator showed the PORV as closed. Why? Because the indicator was only showing the solenoid command signal, the instructions that had been sent to close the valve, not the valve's actual physical state. At the same time, operators were hit with over 100 simultaneous alarms. There was no system to prioritize those alarms, no way to quickly distinguish the root cause from cascading symptoms. It was like trying to diagnose a fire while every smoke detector in the building goes off at once. And then there was a second compounding factor. Those auxiliary feedwater isolations that were left for maintenance 2 days earlier, they blocked backup water for 8 full minutes. The result, the reactor core was uncovered, and approximately half the core suffered severe damage, also known as a partial meltdown. So where in the life cycle did configuration management actually break down? The answer is at multiple points. In the design phase, the PORV indicator was designed to show the valve command signal only. It was never formally reviewed against the requirements that it needed to show the actual valve state. A proper design review would have caught this gap before the plant even started up. In the build and maintenance phase, those auxiliary feedwater isolation valves were left closed after a maintenance test. There was no return to service checklist, no configuration verification step that required restoring all components to their normal state before resuming operations. And in the operate phase, operators were trained on procedures that assumed the instrumentation was accurate, when there was no procedure, none, that addressed what to do if the instruments might be showing incorrect data. But the deepest breakdown was the gap between design and development. The known limitation of the PORV indicator, the fact that it couldn't detect a stuck open valve, was never formally documented, so it was never fixed. That unresolved risk sat in the system for years until the day it mattered most. So what would today's configuration management have looked like? Here are 4 process changes that would have prevented this disaster. First, traceability. In every indicator, a CM2 baseline should require that every controller indicator traces back to the verified system requirement, formally signed off before the plant can start up. If the PORV indicator can't actually confirm valve position, that gap has to be documented and resolved. Secondly, maintenance configuration control. Any valve or component left in a non-normal position after the maintenance should automatically trigger an open change order, one that cannot be closed until it's verified and formally documented. No more paper logs, and nobody checks. Third, real-time configuration status, a digital plant configuration system showing live baseline versus actual state for all safety critical components. Operators should be able to see any deviation from the approved configuration instantly, not discover it 2 hours later. And fourth, pre-operation verification, a mandatory independent checklist confirming that all configuration items have been approved based on the design baseline before returning to operations after any maintenance activities. Not optional, mandatory. The traceability failures at 3 Mile Island were profound. Let me walk you through them. There was no formal requirement baseline connecting the operator's needs, knowing the true valve position, and to the instrument that was supposed to provide that information. That linkage was never documented anywhere. Design drawings didn't show the PORV indicator circuit correctly, but no document captured the known limitation that it could not detect the stuck open valve. Engineers knew about it, it just wasn't written down anywhere that mattered. Maintenance work was tracked on paper, but that paper was never linked back to the configuration baseline, so the closed isolation valve after the maintenance tests weren't visible to anyone reviewing the system state. And operator procedures were not version controlled against the current plant configuration. They were written as design times and used years later without any verification that they still built the as-built, as-operated plant. The chain from safety requirement to design to instrumentation to operator procedure to actual plant state, it was broken at multiple points with no documentation capturing any of those breaks. So what do we take away from all this? The biggest lesson is that CM is a safety system. The absence of configuration management at 3 Mile Island is just a response for the severity of that accident as any mechanical failure. Second, indicators must reflect reality, not just commands. A system that shows what it's told a component to do rather than the component's actually doing creates a dangerous gap between the operator's mental model and the plant's actual state. Third, maintenance must include formal documentation and configuration verification. A paper log is not enough. Every change, every test, every component left in a non-normal state must be tracked, verified, and resolved. Fourth, traceability throughout the life cycle must have no gaps. If you can't trace from a requirement all the way through design, build, test, and operation, that gap is an uncontrolled risk, and uncontrolled risks do not stay theoretical forever. And finally, human factors are directly tied to CM2. Operators can only make good decisions if the information they worked with is accurate and current. Configuration management isn't just about documents and checklists. It's about making sure the people responsible for safety have the truth in front of them when it counts. 3 Mile Island is a powerful reminder that the most dangerous failures aren't always the dramatic ones. Sometimes the most dangerous failures is a document that was never written, a limitation that was never captured, and a gap in traceability that nobody noticed until they had to. Here are the references I used, and thank you for watching.